Welcome to the Bible Questions podcast brought to you by BibleQuestions.org and the Holly Street Church of Christ. This podcast is dedicated to answering your Bible questions from the Bible. My name is Jeff, and along with Brian, we are the hosts of this program.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate those of you that listen to us on a week to week basis. Jeff and I have a goal every week of just simply presenting God's truth. In some cases, for those of you that listen frequently, we're just simply answering questions, right? That's the name of the podcast, Bible Questions. We're answering questions that people submitted. Other times, we're just looking at specific subjects. And today will be one of those cases where we want to talk about our legacy. And Jeff, sometimes I think when people think of legacy, they might be thinking about, well, what will people think of me after I leave this earth, right? Or in other cases, it's, what do we think of people after they've left the earth? And they may not themselves be even thinking about their legacy, but we remember them for what they did while they were here on this earth.
Yes, indeed. And I think a lot of people may be conscious of the influence they have and wanting to leave something for the future and not just living for themselves. But as I think we'll see today, there's, at least from a spiritual perspective, there's a lot of aspects we need to consider what our legacy can be, both positive and negative.
Yeah, that's right. And, I could see both sides of the argument, so to speak, where some will be like, well, really, should we even be thinking about our legacy? I mean, this isn't really about us, right? And yeah, you could have that kind of as an extreme where we're all so focused on our legacy that we're not being genuine or whatever, right? We're looking at that too much. And the other end of the spectrum, we might say, is, we're not at all thinking about our legacy, but we do think about our reputation. We do think about what God has asked us to do as it relates to like letting our light so shine that we bring glory to Him. And so I think what we'll find is, yeah, there's this balance there between we do need to think about these things, but we shouldn't be so wrapped up in it that, it overshadows what's really important. So, for instance, if we think about, well, how do most people think of legacy? Well, I think we would all agree that, if you see a statue of somebody, like I remember visiting Boston one time for work, and I went through like their Central Park, and in the middle of the park was this statue of Paul Revere. And for those of you that live in America, you know that Paul Revere warned of the British who were coming. And so there are certain people in every culture that are highly respected by that culture because of often very great things that they've done. So they might put up a statue to remember that person. Or, like for us, we might name a building after somebody or a street, once again, because of how they've lived their life and the great things that they've done. These people weren't thinking about their legacy, but the society that they lived in decided to recognize them because of the great things that they did. And so that's how, once again, I think most of us probably think of legacy. Now, if we look at a dictionary definition, and I've just got one here from the Oxford Dictionary that says, legacy is the long-lasting impact of either particular events or actions that took place in the past or of a person's life. So that's really what we want to talk about in this podcast is the long-lasting impact of our actions in our life. And once again, that could be, just simply based on how we've lived, which is what God teaches us. Or it could be us also, being conscious of it in the sense that we want to do the right things. And in that sense, it has a long lasting impact. So, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you for any other thoughts and to sort of kick things off.
Well, and I think in many ways we need to be very conscious of, the influence we have on others around about us. That influence can be positive, it can be negative, and as we'll kind of see, can ripple not only for those immediately around about us, but people they know, or over time, generationally. In fact, I think we can see examples of that from the scriptures very easily, Brian. For sure, from a negative perspective, I mean, you only have to start reading through the scriptures and only get into the third chapter, Genesis 3, where you see, after God had made everything very good and had set up Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in a blissful paradise-like existence. We have the first sin committed by Eve based on temptation from the serpent. And then, of course, Adam, joined in with that as well. And because of that sin, not only impacted them immediately, being basically, tossed out of the Garden of Eden, and, somewhat being, severed from a relationship with God, but the ripple effect, the influence, the legacy, specifically Genesis 3 for women, talks about the sorrow being greatly multiplied in childbirth, which I suspect is, a reference to the various, physical, pain and trauma and anguish associated with giving birth to children. For the man was told that the ground was cursed and that in toil he would eat of it, that with thorns and thistles would be injected. And of course, that, both cases have come down through thousands of years, to us today. A very long-lasting legacy, negative legacy of sin. Rolling forward, Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Contextually, the Israelites have left Egypt and they've gone into the wilderness, and now they're on the verge of going into the promised land. And so Moses instructed them to send out some spies to go into the land, to spy it out, to bring back a report, of the land, of the food, of the people, etc. And, the spies were sent in. And I said 10 spies. I think if I remember correctly, I said 12 spies. And they brought back in some ways a partially good report that says, hey, it's a great land. I mean, there's plenty of food, etc. But there's people there, and they're strong and they're mighty and they're powerful, and they've got walled cities. And we were like grasshoppers, little insignificant little insects in their sight. At least 10 of the 12 gave that report. And based on that report, pretty much their lack of faith in God, they convinced the people that, we can't take the land. We're unable to. Of course, they didn't really factor God into the equation. And basically influenced the people to doubt God, to complain to Moses and Aaron, to rebel, if you will, based on their lack of faith. And as a result, the Lord pretty much said, okay, fine, I'm done with you. You will wander in the wilderness that for a period of time, such that everyone who is 20 years old or over, you're going to die. You're going to die in the wilderness. And only those that are currently, less than 20 will be permitted to enter the promised land, and the two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. So again, a lack of faith pretty much, condemned an entire generation to dying in the wilderness, not being allowed to enter the promised land. Once they entered the promised land, they were given specific instructions in terms of casting out the people in the promised land, based on the people's, generational sin. The first town or city, village, whatever that they went against was Jericho. And explicit instructions were given to the Israelites. Don't have anything to do with the city. Basically go in and wipe out the city. Everything there is devoted to God, to include whatever you might find in terms of, clothing and gold and silver, whatever. Just it's all, have nothing to do with it. Well, there was a guy by the name of Achan, Joshua 7, based on his greed. He saw some cool stuff, decided to take it, despite what God had said. And as a result, when they tried to attack the next city, a lot of people were killed. A lot of Israelites were killed in battle. And they inquired, and it turned out that Achan had indeed, pretty much obtained some of the forbidden stuff for himself. And he and his entire family were put to death. Again, a negative legacy or negative impact or negative influence of sin, causing Achan and his family to lose their lives, and a lot of Israelites to die, needlessly. Again, a key point: that of being the negative influence that sin can have on ourselves and on those round about us. Brian, anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's interesting how, sometimes we can just say a name and it immediately tells us their legacy, as you just pointed out, right? So even like with Adam and Eve, you think about, well, Cain, their first son, well, negative legacy, right? He killed his brother Abel, who was faithful. Or think about like Jezebel, very wicked queen, tried to kill Elijah. So anyhow, yeah, it just shows us how powerful, once again, their legacy was. And it's interesting how when we think about the destructive effects of sin, one of the things that can destroy our legacy, if you will, is living a life of sin. And I always find it interesting, when you go to a funeral, normally you're never going to hear. In fact, I can't think of one time where somebody got up there and said, well, this person that died, they were just a scoundrel. They were a drunkard. They were a thief. No, they're focusing on the very positive parts of his legacy. And he's in heaven looking down on us and all of those sorts of things. But the reality is that God knows what our legacy is. God knows the lasting effects that we've had. And I think just for a second, just want to think about how sin can prevent us from doing those positive things that would leave a positive legacy of ourselves. So when you think about the destructive elements of sin for ourselves, it first and foremost causes mental turmoil. And there are so many passages that talk about this. And as we live our lives, we see this. So for instance, Psalm 38, verse 17, my sorrow is continually before me. Verse 18, I will be in anguish over my sin. Psalm 51, verse 3, my sin is always before me. Proverbs 22, verse 8, he who sows iniquity will reap sorrow. So one of the things we all know just from living our life is that when you commit a sin, especially if it's a very terrible sin, not that we rank sins, but the truth is there are some that have such a lasting mental effect on us and can cripple us. There could even be physical consequences, right? You could drive drunk and crash your car and be permanently disabled. And so Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8 say, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruptions. And so you think about addictions and these physical disabilities or physical pain, mental pain, all of these things are just, once again, showing the destructive effects of sin on ourselves. And ultimately, it can lead to spiritual consequences, such as, we could sin in such a way, or if we commit sin enough, I guess I should say, it'll sear our conscience where sin no longer bothers us. And I've always liked this proverb in Proverbs 6, chapter 6, verse 28 that says, can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be seared? So eventually, if you sin enough, you're going to sear that conscience. And you could get to the point that we read about in Ephesians 4:19, where it says, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. So the destructive effects of sin not only affect our legacy, but it can just tarnish us to a point where we're almost not even aware of how far we've let ourselves go. And then ultimately, it could lead us to fall away. Jeff, can I get you to read 2 Peter 2, verses 20 through 22, where it talks about that?
Sure. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow, having washed, to her wallowing in the mire.
So we have a situation here where it would almost be better if you didn't know the truth, we're told here, of course, than to turn from the truth and ultimately leave a negative legacy for yourself to the world. And of course, Jeff, it can extend beyond that, right? But beyond just ourselves, it can even affect others, right?
Right. Well, and sort of working our way outward, to the family, right? Proverbs 10, verse 1, a foolish son is the grief of his mother, or Proverbs 17:25, a foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. Sometimes in terms of the other way around, the children seeing the sinful lifestyle of their parents and imitate what they see. Good example here. In fact, tell you what, Brian, you want to read 1 Kings 15 verses 25 and 26?
Absolutely. Yeah, here talking about Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, it says, became king over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in his sin by which he had made Israel.
Right. And we can kind of see that played out in our lives. For example, you start seeing families that are like, multi-generational dysfunction. They're families that are into drug abuse or into crime or into, just worldliness, or, they have this culture of, partying and, lust and fornication, etc. Or, multi-generational families that are just all into secular success and fame and fortune and money and wealth, etc. Multi-generational families that are, um, I'm reminded here in the United States, we talk about, feuding families, the Hatfields and the McCoys, or families that are just, multi-generational, angry or adversarial or provocative, or they're always causing trouble, etc. Again, generation after generation, passed down. It becomes almost like the culture of the family, or the norm of the family. Again, from a negative, sinful, wickedness perspective. But Brian, there's a lot of positive legacies, or positive influence, or multi-generational positive things that can occur as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, to your point, yeah, there's a lot of negative, certainly examples in the Bible and that we see in society. But the good news is there's a lot of positive legacies as well that we can learn from. And so, as we kind of look at that aspect of this, we look at certain people in the Bible and what, when their name is given, do you think about? Like, for instance, the Apostle Paul, nothing but positive, right? But when he was Saul of Tarsus, it was very different, right? He was openly persecuting the church. I mean, how about when we think about like Ruth? If you know the story of Ruth, it's very positive. And for the sake of time, we won't go through everything about her life. But for those of you that are familiar, or if you'd like to become more familiar, just look at the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And what you'll see is it's a story about a woman named Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. And so here you have her husband and her two sons married Ruth and Orpah. Over a period of time, all three of these men died, and these three women were left alone. And so Naomi decided that she was going to go back to her home country. She was living in Moab at the time. She decided that I'm going to return to Judah, my home country. And she encouraged her two daughters-in-laws, go find yourself another husband. You guys are very young. Like, I'm too old to find another husband in her mind, she said. But you're still very young. Go find yourself another husband. You deserve that. Well, Orpah took her up on that and left, but Ruth did not want that. Ruth wanted to be with Naomi, to help her, to support her. And so, as a result of her love for her mother-in-law, she gained a tremendous reputation, a tremendous legacy, we might say. So, for instance, over in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 11, Boaz, which was a relative of Naomi, basically said to Ruth, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and have come to a people whom you did not know before." So Ruth left her own country to join once again Naomi and to help her out. And I like how Boaz says, it's been fully reported to me. That's her reputation. She had a good reputation. Also, Boaz said to her in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." So think about her legacy. And we see this in our world today. When people are righteous people, then others want to help you because they know of your reputation. Then one final one's in chapter 4 of Ruth in verse 15. So this is after now Boaz marries Ruth. They have a child. And Naomi was really, not going to have her family's name live on. Boaz recognized that and said, I'm going to marry Ruth so that Naomi's family name can live on. And so the women of Judah said to Naomi, for your daughter in law, of course, Ruth, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons. So once again, we see this unselfish attitude of Ruth. And as a result of that, she had a tremendous reputation. And when we think about her, even to this day, we think about nothing but positive things. Jeff?
Yeah, the only thing I might add to that is for our listeners who may not realize, Moab, basically a pagan country, pagan culture. So we have this woman, even though born into perhaps a sinful, idolatrous culture, country, whatever, made positive life choices and overcame that background, overcame the bad influence, if you will, of her society. To be a very outstanding example for us even today. Speaking, Brian, of examples, Abraham, comes to mind. In fact, several incidents, if you will, where God told him to do something and he obeyed. And because of that, he has left a legacy, a positive legacy, if you will, for us today. For example, Hebrews chapter 11, in what is sometimes called Faith's Hall of Fame, a large number of people that are listed as, positive, encouraging examples for us today. Abraham is in there, starting with verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. This was, God calling him out of Ur of the Chaldees, if I remember correctly, to, come over into the promised land, land of Canaan. Verse 9, by faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. Verse 10, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. But I guess more importantly, in terms of legacy, Genesis chapter 22, verse 18, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Now, there's another passage that leverages that verse, Genesis 22:18, in your seed, singular, meaning the Christ. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. Your descendant from Abraham, Jesus, would do that because Abraham, and certainly that's a major positive legacy. Might even mention Sarah is cited in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age because she judged him faithful who had promised. And Hebrews 11, verses 12, with both Abraham and Sarah, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Physically, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob, which became the nation of Israel, which ultimately resulted with Moses in Exodus, leaving Egypt, being selected for special promises in the promised land, etc. Very, very positive legacy from both Abraham and Sarah. Now, Brian, I might very quickly add, certainly a lot of things to be commended, in their lives, what they've done in obedience to God. Doesn't mean they're sinless. In fact, some of these examples, we see them being, I don't know if I want to say somewhat human, subject to temptation, poor choices, as we all are. But in many cases, overcoming those to still be a very positive example, positive influence, and leave a very positive legacy.
Yeah, that's a really good point because we don't want to think that, well, they had it easy, or they were righteous and they never made a mistake. Everyone, Romans 3:23, right, has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's exactly right. Another example that comes to mind, as far as somebody that left a positive legacy, is Moses. And so if you know the story of Moses, when he was a child, Pharaoh in Egypt was very concerned that the Hebrew people were becoming very strong. And, after Joseph brought his family into Egypt, and moved forward several generations, of course, they had children and they became very, very large. And of course, Pharaoh felt threatened and said, if these people continue to grow like they are, well, they might overthrow the kingdom. And so he sent out this decree where all babies, Hebrew babies, were to be put to death to help kind of slow down the population growth, if you will. Well, if you know the story, Moses' mother hid him, and he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who didn't put him to death, but instead, and we kind of see the providence of the Lord here, I believe, where, not only did she not kill him, but she went ahead and raised him in her household and selected Moses' mother to be the one to raise him. Once again, certainly see God's providence here. Now, Moses growing up in the house of Pharaoh, we could say, well, that was a pretty good life, right? I mean, he had the riches of Egypt, certainly could have just about anything he wanted growing up in Pharaoh's house. But he was the kind of man that was not interested in that. And so over in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 24, it says, by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Such a wonderful legacy. In fact, he had such a great reputation, if you will, and his righteousness was recognized by God, to the point where, as you know, God selected him to go and lead the people out of Egypt, as in the Israelites out of Egypt, God's chosen people. So that tells you a whole lot about what God thought about him, right, Jeff?
Exactly. Could say overcoming the pagan influence as he was growing up within the Egyptian culture, multiple gods, polytheism, and made a good positive life choice, if you will, as you mentioned, to align themselves with the Israelites and not with the Egyptians. So he in some ways overcame his upbringing, so to speak.
Sure did.
Well, and we've already kind of mentioned already, Hebrews 11. A lot of people mentioned there Noah and Moses and Abraham and Sarah, etc. Goes on to say, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, suffering hardship. Verse 35. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And then, of course, that whole chapter, if you will, as we've mentioned, kind of serves as an example to us, an encouragement to us. And all of these people, even though they're dead physically, still, in some ways, speak to us today. If they can overcome their culture, or if they can overcome, negative influence of their parents, or if they can overcome the, sinful morality of the people around about them and be faithful to God. Of course, the overall message is, so can we. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's right. And I like how earlier you called, Hebrews 11 kind of like the faith's hall of fame, right? Because when you think of Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Gideon and Barak and all of these, their legacy leaves us a very positive impression. And we hopefully can go back and read about their lives. And also, to the point you made, we'll see, David's one that's mentioned in there. He certainly wasn't sinless, but overall, he was called a man after God's own heart who would do all his will, right? So we see the effect that their life had on how we remember them and the lessons that we can learn from them. And it's the same for us. When you think about when we are righteous, it has such a powerful effect on others. Jesus talked about in Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus also said in John 15, verse 8, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. So all those good things that we do that lead to positive outcomes is what the Bible calls bearing fruit, and God is ultimately glorified. Not us. We shouldn't be worried about our glory. It's all about glorifying God because, oh, by the way, this is his system of righteousness that we're just simply following. Over in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, here Peter says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason or ask you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So by our conduct, people can tell if you're righteous. And there will be a certain number of people throughout your life that will ask you, why do you behave the way you do? You never use foul language. You're always so kind to others. And it gives you an opportunity to say, well, I do so because this is what I've learned through God's word. And you know what? It can change your life as well. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So even those who may be enemies or even those unrighteous people, once again, as it says here, by your good works which they observe, ultimately God will be glorified. And so that should be our goal. And so can have a tremendous effect, Jeff, right? Our righteousness on others.
Well, exactly. Well, and to further that point, several different passages talk about how we can influence for good, or edify or build up one another. Romans chapter 14, verse 9. Therefore, let us pursue the things which make for peace and the things by which one may edify another. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, it talks about putting on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. And especially in terms of, with fellow Christians, Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. Coming together with fellow faithful Christians, assembling together regularly on the Lord's Day, worshiping together, working together, etc. Definitely has a positive impact, positive influence, and is something that God recognizes and commands Christians to do. We also see the kinds of effect of righteousness on others within not only our spiritual family, fellow Christians, but also within our physical family. Sometimes there's the phrase actions speak louder than words. Certainly the influence that we as parents and also as grandparents, pivotal influence on children growing up. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The admonishing that we can do as parents for our children. Proverbs 29, verse 17, correct your son and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul. 1 Thessalonians 5:17, comfort each other, edify one another, etc. A lot of positive influence, positive legacy, positive encouragement that we can have not only on our physical family, but also our spiritual family, and vice versa. Brian, anything you want to add?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And kind of like we were talking about on the negative side, we can certainly have a negative effect on our families to the point where there could end up being generations of wicked people. Well, the same is for righteous. if we are righteous and we teach our children and raise them in the Lord, as we might say, and they are righteous and they do the same for their children and the children's children and so forth, you could end up with several generations of righteous people. I mean, I think about my own family. My grandparents were Christians and my parents were Christians, and I'm a Christian, and I've trained my children to be Christians. And so we can just see, whether it's negative or positive, our righteousness and of course our wickedness can affect generations to come. And this to me is such a critical point, because I think sometimes we're so focused on ourselves. And no doubt, as we were just talking about, we want to be focused on, how we affect those in our community, let's say around us, and certainly the brethren in our church. But how about our own families? Think about the powerful effect that you can have on your family for generations to come by simply being righteous. And so, Jeff, I think we would agree that's what God really wants, right? He would prefer to see righteous generation.
Well, for sure. And especially if you think, at the very least, in terms of the amount of time that, parents and children are in the family, 16, 18 plus years, and the time and the opportunities that are present there. In terms of a spiritual family, mentioned about, worship and assembling together. Depending on your congregation, that might be, Bible class on Sunday, Sunday morning worship, Sunday evening worship, might even be Wednesday evening Bible class, or other opportunities where Christians can come together. Sometimes just even to share a meal outside of the context of the church assembly, where they can, encourage one another to do what's right. The other thing I might mention, just in terms of, generational. Yeah, in fact, Brian, why don't you turn over to Psalm 78? There's a passage over there. The context is like verses 4 through 7, but you might want to focus on reading 5 and 6 for our audience.
Yeah, and this is really an extension of what we were saying as it relates to, when you're righteous, it's possible to have generations of righteous people. In fact, that was God's desire. And we see that in Psalm 78 over here, where it says, "We will not hide them," as in the law and works of the Lord, "from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." And yeah, if you know the history of Israel, a great example is when Joshua brought the Israelites into the land of Canaan. Much like Moses had instructed prior to that, that it would be critical that they teach their children about all that God had done for them, so that they would remember not only God and his great works, but why he gave them the law to live by, because it was for their own good. But we saw after Joshua died, and the elders that were with Joshua died, that in Judges we're told there arose a generation that did not know God, nor the things that he had done. And so the same can happen to us today. All it takes is one generation of parents who do not teach the children about the truth. And next thing you know, you could have those, once again, multi-generations of sinful people. Whereas the opposite's true here, as it says in Psalm 78, God said, "Teach them to your children, have your children teach them to their children." So once again, you perpetuate this righteousness for generations to come. And so, Jeff, I think we've made the point, right? That there can be a lot of good that can come for many years by us simply being righteous as God would expect.
Exactly, and living the kind of life before others that God would have us to live. Brian, I'm also kind of wondering if you had any sort of, how we kind of maybe perhaps make application of this in our lives on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, let's talk about that. As we've been kind of saying, this one's probably sort of obvious, right? But be conscious of our conduct and be committed to making a positive impact on the lives of others. People are watching us for good or for evil. And I often think, Jeff, about young children, right? And how much of an impression not only can we make on our own children, but even the children in the world who are constantly watching to see how you behave and so forth. And when you do those things that are righteous, it makes a positive impact on others. And so to kind of go along with that, we want to understand that the results of our conduct can have a long lasting impact. And there's two verses here. I'll read one, Jeff, and I'll have you read one if you would. And that is, the Holy Spirit through Paul had him give advice to Timothy and Titus. So the first one to Timothy is in 1 Timothy 4, verse 12, where Paul said to Timothy, be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. So Paul wanted to emphasize to Timothy, be that good example, because otherwise, as a preacher, if you're not a good example, why would they listen to you, right? And Jeff, we see a similar thought to Titus, right? In Titus chapter 2, verses 7 and 8.
Right. Where the Holy Spirit through Paul instructed Titus in all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned. Yeah, it's interesting, Brian, the point you're making, like, parents in a position of influence, preachers in a position of influence, Bible class teachers, even the influence that we can have on like people at work, neighbors, family extended family members, acquaintances, friends, etc. Just a lot of application.
Sure is. And so hopefully, our listeners will agree and understand that when it comes to our legacy, we do want to be conscious of our reputation, but more importantly, sometimes we say things take care of themselves. So in other words, if you're righteous and you're doing what's right, it can have such positive, as you said early on, Jeff, right, ripple effects for the society we live in and ultimately for generations to come. So be conscious of your legacy. And once again, try to live in such a way that you'll have a positive impact for a long time. All right. Why don't we go ahead and shift gears now, Jeff, and answer a few questions that have been submitted along this line. So the first question for you comes from Basayo. He says, concerning 1 Timothy 5:8, if the separated mother tells the father to stay away and rejects any financial assistance from him for herself or the children, is the father free of his obligation?
Yeah, and in some ways, first of all, we have to start off with 1 Timothy 5, what verse 8 says, which is a very strong statement. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, Brian, there's some really ugly situations out there, hostile divorces, particularly involving children, that can present a very challenging situation. If you have the husband-wife in a somewhat adversarial relationship, and children, being kind of caught in the middle, and at least for a godly parent, you want to try to be a good parent, even though the marriage has been dissolved. At least in terms of for the children, financial support, still try to be a good role model, still try and model what a good husband or parent would be, try to provide moral, scriptural principles and guidance, etc. That can be challenging, very challenging to do that when the other spouse is interfering with the process, interfering with access, like the questioner asks, or the adversarial spouse, kind of poisons the well. I think we have a phrase by sometimes subtly bad mouthing, the quote unquote righteous parent that's trying to do what's right. Sometimes even interferes from a legal perspective, in terms of getting custody of the children or having a restraining order that prohibits contact or very limits the contact. Bottom line is for the righteous Christian who is still trying to exert some degree of influence in those situations, trying to do what you can do, to still try to be a good influence, especially while the children are still young, um, and where, financial support is allowed, where role modeling is allowed, where some degree of moral, spiritual, influence is allowed, take advantage of those opportunities. Unfortunately, but still recognizing there may be interference from the other parent or even legal constraints. So yeah, a very sad situation where it's like you still try to do the best with what you have in the circumstances you find yourself in. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, to me, one of the most tragic things with the divorce is depending on whom the court gives custody to, those children could go with a spouse that's ungodly. Maybe they've committed adultery, maybe they've fallen away, and so that will be the influence that they have. And meanwhile, the other spouse that may get like visitation rights, is trying to undo that wickedness. And so you sort of have this, competing philosophies, if you will, one based on spiritual values, one based on worldly values, and often children are caught in the middle of all of that. So anyhow, it's just normally a bad thing when that happens.
Right. Well, and then the other thing I might add is if the parents are not aligned, I mean, even if they're still within a marriage, right? If the parents are not aligned, but especially in a divorce situation like we've been talking about, if one parent is trying to exert a positive influence, and the other parent is exerting a negative influence, we talked about the children being caught in the middle, but you also have the children with some degree of negative influences from, perhaps public school or their peers. Those children more often than not will tend to side over with the negative influence. I'm not saying the Christian parent should give up, but just recognize reality that, yeah, do everything you can, but children still are free moral agents and they will choose, make life choices that hopefully consider your influence, but there's still also no guarantee.
Right. That's exactly right.
Let's see. Next question comes in from Keith, and he writes in, "Who is Jabez in Second Chronicles?"
Yeah, so when I looked at this, I wasn't able to find anyone by that name in Second Chronicles, but there is somebody by the name of Jabez in First Chronicles, so I think he just got that wrong, but not a big deal. We're not told much about him, but what's interesting is he did have a good reputation, or we might say legacy, based on what we do read about him. We're told he was a reputable man. So in First Chronicles chapter 4, beginning in verse 9, it says, "Now Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called him his name Jabez, saying, Because I bore him in pain. And Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, Oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me, and that you would keep me from evil, that I might not cause pain." So God granted him what he requested. So it's kind of interesting. Very honorable. It says here, more honorable than his brothers. We kind of gather that because God granted him what he requested, that once again, he was a righteous and honorable man. And so we see, hey, positive legacy, right? From this man who we don't know anything about other than what we read here, but, his name lives on, if you will, based on the good testimony about him. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I looked up in a commentary called Jameson Fawcett Brown Commentary, and here it says about the man, the Jewish writers affirm that he was an eminent doctor in the law, whose reputation drew so many scribes around him that a town was called by his name. And it mentions 1 Chronicles 2:55. And to the piety of his character, this passage bears ample testimony. So yeah, kind of interesting, Jeff, how doesn't always have to be somebody famous like some we were talking about, right? Or well known, maybe I should say. But yet, this man still has a very good reputation to this day because of his conduct when he lived.
You raise an interesting point that I hadn't thought a lot about. There's a lot of people in the Bible who are unnamed or may not even be mentioned, and yet their positive influence lives on. I'm thinking, for instance, of wives and mothers, for example. There's a lot of them that There are some that their names are given, but in a lot of cases their names are not given or they're not even mentioned. But they're behind the scenes, right? Working with their children, passing on information about what it means, like for instance under the Jewish law, or Christians, etc. Christian mothers, wives and mothers, passing along that positive influence to the next generation, sort of helping to shape, if you will, future generations, without any sort of publicity or fame or accolades or receiving awards or publicity, etc. Just quietly working behind the scenes, making a difference.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right, Jeff, the next question for you comes from an anonymous person who said, can you comment on the religious influence of people like Martin Luther, Mother Teresa, Billy Graham, and the recently assassinated Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, and this particular question, and for those in our audience who may not realize, you might recognize some of the names, but the reference to Charlie Kirk, at least when this podcast was being recorded, I think he was assassinated, I believe, within the last week or so, and evidently had a lot of influence, particularly on college age kids. But let me sort of answer the question a little bit more generally. Um, the answer to the question is kind of an interesting and kind of challenging. For example, if I go to Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verse 7, he writes, "Brethren, join in following my example and note those who so walk as you have us for a pattern." Hebrews chapter 6, verse 12, that encourages the audience, do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, Holy Spirit through Paul writing to the Corinthians, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. We'll come back to that particular phrase, I think, is key. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. I mean, ultimately, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, therefore be imitators of God as dear children. And so what we have here is, as we've kind of mentioned before, both positive and negative. Certainly a lot of people in history have set a wonderful example in some aspect of their lives. Speaking out against false doctrine, as Martin Luther did, helping the poor, as Mother Teresa did, talking about God and, Judeo-Christian values, as, both Billy Graham and Charlie Kirk did. And yet, as we've seen with some of the biblical examples, that does not mean that they're sinless. That does not mean that their lives are perfect. That does not mean we should imitate, every single aspect of their lives. Or it doesn't even mean that what they taught was 100% in alignment with the scriptures. So what we potentially have to be careful of is examine what all these people say and the lives they lived in light of what Christ said and did, or what God said is required through the scriptures. And so, people can be very influential, but they can promote a false plan of salvation. They can promote false doctrine, or, even be, originators of denominations that are not in alignment completely with God's will. And as we've said already, that's not unique to people in our more recent history, but it's also true of people in the Bible. David and Bathsheba, a classic example. Peter denying Jesus, a classic example. So we need to be very discerning and follow religious people only as they follow Christ. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and it is kind of an interesting dynamic because when you think about like Martin Luther protesting the sins of the Catholic Church, and Mother Teresa, who is very kind to people, and Billy Graham, who taught a lot of good biblical principles, even some error, if nothing else, their reputation caused people to look into God's word. And, hopefully by looking in it, they could say, well, you know what, they were right down the line on this, but they were not actually accurate in this other area spiritually. And so it's kind of interesting, even in that case, there could be some good come from the things that they said and did that ultimately led people to the truth, who then saw, according to the scriptures, what the truth was and maybe obeyed the gospel. So anyhow.
Yeah, and those are all very good points. All right, I think that takes us to our last question, Brian, that you get from Andrew. He writes in, do we have concrete historical facts that Jesus ever existed, not using the Bible or the Quran as a reference book? In other words, are there other sources of actual facts about Jesus?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, probably the most well-known one is a historian named Josephus. He acknowledged in his words a man named Jesus existed. And in fact, here's a quote from one of his writings called Josephus, the Essential Writings, which is a kind of a summary of a lot of his writings. But anyhow, he says, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. So here's a man who is simply a historian, just writing down what he observed and the reputation that Jesus had among the people. And then you have others like Tacitus and Tranquillus and Pliny. These are other historians that made references to Jesus as well. And certainly, if any are interested, they can go and research some statements they made about Jesus. Once again, from a historical perspective. And I think, though, we should all realize and probably acknowledge that, ultimately, it's our faith in God and his son Jesus, as was mentioned, for instance, in Hebrews 11:6, where it talks about that without faith, it's impossible to please him, that we have to believe that he is and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Or John 8:24, right, where Jesus said that, unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sin. So it ultimately takes faith. But I can understand why people look to see if beyond the Bible there's anything written about Jesus, and there is. But just want to make sure that we all understand the intent. Much like Jesus told Thomas, you saw me after I, rose from the dead, and you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen me and believe. So it really is about faith, right, Jeff? And so it's kind of a balance. We can be interested, but ultimately we have to have faith that Jesus existed.
True. Well, and you talk about legacy, certainly from a, dying for our sins perspective, Jesus, massive legacy. But more subtly, I mean, while you were talking, I'm thinking, what year is it? It's 2025. Well, 2025 AD, Anno Domini, year of the Lord, goes back to a rough estimate of when Christ was born. We count our years from roughly the time of Jesus' birth. And certainly his, influence through Christianity out through, the entire planet. Probably the best example, if I could use that term, of a positive legacy now for basically 2,000 years. So there's I guess that factor as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. Well, this brings an end to this podcast. Hopefully you found that it's been helpful. If you'd like to study a little bit more on some of the things that we discussed, go to our website, BibleQuestions.org. And if you look under the letter C in Christian Living, you'll see several articles and questions that have been answered about that subject. As far as F, you can look at that for family, I for influence, and W for works. So I highly encourage you to continue studying this and really be conscious once again of the reputation that you have, but more importantly, all of the good that you can do, hopefully for generations, just by being righteous and obeying God's will.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Bible Questions podcast. We invite you to visit our website at BibleQuestions.org, where you can find over 1,000 scripture filled articles on a wide variety of Bible topics, along with about 24 free Bible study lessons and other Bible study aids. Plus, you can submit a Bible question to us to get a personal response within a couple of days. Check it all out at BibleQuestions.org.